Okay, here we go. My heartfelt apology. I am sorry for every time I laughed at an X gonna give it to you meme last year. I swear, it was all in good fun, but this Nemesis guy seems pissed. I've spent the past week or so testing the Resident Evil 3 remake, barely a year after Resident Evil 2. Capcom is quickly working its way through the RE back catalog, retelling the story of the pas de trois between Jill, Carlos, and Nemesis as a mysterious pandemic sweeps through Raccoon City. It's, weird timing for a pandemic story, but I'm excited by the return of the RE engine. Resident Evil 2 ran like a dream, and the good news is that Resident Evil 3 essentially follows in its well-optimized footsteps, though I still wish Capcom would streamline the graphics settings a bit. They're way more confusing than they need to be. Instead of the usual low, medium, high, ultra presets, Capcom opts for the theoretically friendlier sounding performance priority, balanced, graphics priority, and max labels. But the differences between them can be vast, and the performance ramifications sometimes unclear. Just like in Doom Eternal, VRAM is presented as the limiting factor here, but unlike Doom, which capped the player's options depending on available VRAM, Resident Evil 3 simply says you may run into issues. You may? Like, what does that even mean? And you probably won't, that's the weird part. The VRAM numbers Resident Evil 3 lists are nonsensical. Or rather, they don't represent what you think they represent. Likely what's happening is the game is reserving more and more VRAM to stream in the same set of textures, and especially if you're on an SSD, that's a non-issue. The standard high 1GB will work absolutely fine. It's a strange way to handle graphics settings, compounded by confusing labels like medium, half a gig, and high half a gig, and I swear I have stared and stared and stared at every wall and zombie and sign, but I will be damned if I can tell you the difference between those two. Here's the simple truth. None of it really matters if you're running a semi-modern GPU. Most low-end cards will default to the balanced preset, which already uses a variant of the high textures and looks totally fine. Even our entry-level GTX 1650 managed to average 75 frames per second here. There's almost no reason to dip to the performance priority preset unless you're trying to run Resident Evil 3 on an ATM or something. And that's good because it looks terrible. The ultra-compressed textures are unreadable at times, like literally in the case of this corkboard. Yeesh, it's like a bad Xbox 360 game up in here. So yeah, balanced is likely where most of the lowest of low-end cards will end up. Still, the barrier to entry for the graphics priority preset isn't very high. Our GTX 1660 Ti and RX 5600 XT both averaged north of 100 frames per second here. Again, it's very easy to run Resident Evil 3 despite what the VRAM meter might tell you. And past the graphics priority preset, it's diminishing returns. As I said, you can eat more VRAM by moving texture quality to high 2GB, high 4GB, or even high 8GB, but you probably won't notice much of a difference visually. Same textures, bigger pool of memory to stream them from. To use Capcom's own language, exceeding your VRAM limit may result in stuttering, maybe, but probably not. Anyway, if you're running on a decade-old PC or a low-end laptop or whatever and looking for settings to tweak, start with Ambient Occlusion. HBAO is suitable for high-end GPUs, but SSAO is a decent compromise, netting you an 8% boost to frame rate with barely any visible impact. Disabling Ambient Occlusion entirely can make that a 12% boost, but the scene starts to look pretty washed out. There's also no point to running shadow quality at max. Drop it to high and you'll save over 1 gig of VRAM and boost your frame rate by 5 to 10% with no real loss of fidelity. Disabling reflections can also help, providing a 9% bump in our tests. Unfortunately, there's no in-between here. Reflections are either on or off, and I really, really prefer them on. Raccoon City is all wet streets and neon signs, and the ambiance suffers a lot when you lose the pinks and purples that are reflecting off the ground. It even has a minor impact on the game itself, as zombies also show up in reflections. The same goes for Bloom, which provides a relatively minor 4% bump when disabled, but kills the subtle fog effect around neon signs. Just leave it on. Lastly, I want to complain a bit about anti-aliasing. Resident Evil 3 includes FXAA, TAA, a blend of FXAA and TAA, and SMAA, and yes, that is a hell of a tongue twister. Trouble is, all of them are flawed. The RE engine does this weird thing with the reflections where they look grainy, almost like low-end ray tracing. TAA helps mask this because it blurs the edges of everything, and indeed, all of Resident Evil 3's presets default to TAA or a combination of TAA and FXAA. But again, TAA blurs the edges of everything in the scene. It's like a thick Vaseline smear across your screen, or soft focus if you want to be generous about it. So you might be tempted to use either the low-weight FXAA in isolation or the higher-end SMAA. Unfortunately, removing TAA means everything sparkles like it's covered in glitter. Just look at it sparkle. Look at it go. It's like the pavement's ready for a rave. I ended up sticking with the TAA and FXAA combo even though I don't love the soft focus effect. It's less distracting than the sparkles. Barely. Thanks as always to MSI for providing the hardware we used for testing. We'll be back soon with recommendations for Mountain Blade 2 and more. And remember, even if Mr. X didn't give it to you, Nemesis most certainly will. So stay away from those walls, friends.